These are 13 films from 1983 that lost millions, destroyed careers, and became legendary failures. Return of the Jedi dominated theaters that year, but an extraordinary number of expensive productions crashed spectacularly in its shadow. Fantasy epics, franchise sequels, and star vehicles all hemorrhaged money while earning devastating reviews. And this is the story of Hollywood's costliest mistakes from that brutal year. The year's most complete catastrophe has to be The Lonely Lady, a film that became the benchmark for bad filmmaking. Pia Zadora starred as an aspiring screenwriter in this Harold Robbins adaptation, which carried a budget between $6 and $7 million. And here's where it gets interesting. Approximately half of that funding came from Zadora's husband, billionaire Meshulam Riklis. Domestic earnings totaled just $1.2 million, which meant a staggering loss of roughly $5 to $6 million before anyone even factored in marketing costs. Universal Pictures distributed this disaster, directed by Peter Sasdy, and it landed in theaters on September 30th, 1983. Critics showed no mercy whatsoever. Roger Ebert delivered perhaps the most brutal assessment when he noted that if the film had even a shred of style and humor, it could qualify as the worst movie of the year. But unfortunately, it wasn't even that good. The Hollywood Reporter called it ineptly executed in nearly every aspect. Even Harold Robbins himself, who collected $600,000 upfront for the rights, called it crap. 6 wins from 11 nominations at the 4th Golden Raspberry Awards tells you everything, including Worst Picture, Worst Actress, Worst Director, Worst Screenplay, Worst Musical Score, and Worst Original Song. Zadora later won Worst New Star of the Decade at the 10th Razzies. Careers crumbled in the aftermath. Director Sasdy never helmed another theatrical film, and the screenwriters vanished from Hollywood entirely. Only Ray Liotta, appearing in his film debut, emerged unscathed and went on to major stardom. Two of a Kind arrived with enormous expectations as the attempted Grease reunion for John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John, and it disappointed on nearly every level imaginable. $14 million went into production, with another $5 to $6 million covering marketing, bringing the total investment to approximately $19 to $20 million. Domestic returns hit $23.6 million, which sounds acceptable until you realize the break-even threshold sat between $28 and $35 million. 20th Century Fox released this John Hertzfeld-directed romantic fantasy on December 16, 1983, and the premise bordered on absurd. Angels were betting on whether humanity deserves a second chance, with Earth's fate resting entirely on whether Travolta's small-time con artist can reform. And Charles Durning played God. Roger Ebert awarded just 1.5 out of 4 stars, expressing clear exasperation at movies where angels ask God to give mankind a second chance on the condition that John Travolta reforms. Janet Maslin wondered aloud whether it was really that difficult to find a passable screen vehicle for these 2 stars. 5 Razzie nominations followed: Worst Picture, Worst Actor, Worst Actress, Worst Director, and Worst Screenplay, though all of them lost to The Lonely Lady sweep. Travolta entered a decade-long exile from A-list status that stretched until Pulp Fiction rescued him in 1994. Newton-John's theatrical film career effectively ended here, with subsequent credits consisting almost entirely of television movies. The soundtrack went platinum with 3 hit singles, including Twist of Fate, reaching number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, proving audiences wanted the music but not the movie. Cannon Films delivered a period disaster with The Wicked Lady, and Faye Dunaway's Bodice Ripper barely registered at the box office. $724,000 in earnings against a budget between $8 and $15 million meant potential losses of $14 million or more. Michael Winner directed this remake of the 1945 British classic, casting Dunaway alongside Alan Bates, John Gielgud, Denholm Elliott, and a young Marina Sirtis. The UK premiere came in March 1983, with the United States release following on October 28th. Critical reception turned brutal quickly, and the film became notorious for a topless whip fight scene that British censors demanded be cut. Critics called it a strange mixture of intrigue that failed to connect with audiences, and at the Razzies, Faye Dunaway earned a Worst Actress nomination but lost to Pia Zadora. Winner described his approach as Bonnie and Clyde in the 17th century, but audiences rejected the attempt to inject exploitation elements into period drama. As a Cannon Films production, it exemplified the company's tendency toward controversial content over quality, contributing to perceptions that canon prioritized sensationalism over substance. Even a script by John Hughes couldn't save Nate and Hayes from becoming a troubled production that sank without a trace. $12 million covered the budget, with another $2.5 to $3 million going toward advertising, and this pirate adventure also released internationally as Savage Islands. Tommy Lee Jones starred as real-life pirate Bully Hayes alongside Michael O'Keefe and Jenny Seagrove, with director Ferdinand Fairfax filming across New Zealand and Fiji. Paramount Pictures handled distribution for the November 18, 1983 release, which earned just $1.96 million domestically, representing a near total loss of approximately $13 to $14 million. Roger Ebert called it a loud, confusing, pointless mess, and critics noted it was an obvious Raiders of the Lost Ark knockoff that couldn't match Spielberg's craft. Multiple setbacks plagued production, with shooting running 2 weeks over schedule due to weather and technical difficulties. Paramount allegedly declined to promote it heavily to avoid competition with their upcoming Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Here's an interesting detail. The film contains a rope bridge scene nearly identical to Temple of Doom, but Nate and Hayes released a year earlier. That coincidence couldn't generate any positive buzz for this forgotten adventure. Columbia's ambitious space fantasy, Krull, couldn't compete with Star Wars, no matter how much money they threw at it. Budget estimates range from $27 to $47 million, with crew members claiming $30 million, after concept changes kept ballooning costs. Domestic earnings hit just $16.92 million, and FilmSite estimates an inflation-adjusted loss of approximately $91 million. Ken Marshall starred as Prince Colwyn, with Lisette Anthony, whose voice was dubbed by Lindsay Krause, and early career appearances by Liam Neeson and Robbie Coltrane. Director Peter Yates released this epic on July 29, 1983, just 2 months after Return of the Jedi dominated everything. Janet Maslin wrote that the film has more depth than excitement, while Time Out criticized it as strong on stunts and special effects, but often rambling. The Rotten Tomatoes consensus states the film is painfully derivative, landing at a 35% critics score. Production troubles ran deep throughout filming. Director Yates reportedly hated working on the film and took an unplanned vacation to the Caribbean mid-production, causing a 3-week halt. 23 huge sets spread across more than 10 sound stages at Pinewood Studios. Ken Marshall's movie career ended before it could even get started, though he later found success on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Liam Neeson and Robbie Coltrane went on to major stardom. A cult following has developed significantly, with the iconic glaive weapon becoming a cultural touchstone. Curse of the Pink Panther attempted to continue the franchise without Peter Sellers, and that decision proved disastrous from the start. Approximately $11 million went into production, but earnings reached just $4.49 million, leaving an estimated loss of $6.5 million or more. MGM and United Artists released this Blake Edwards-directed entry on August 12, 1983. Ted Wass starred as bumbling detective Clifton Slay, with David Niven in his final film role. Niven passed 2 weeks before release and looked visibly ill on screen. Herbert Lom returned to the series, and Roger Moore appeared in a cameo as Clouseau in disguise, though critics noted only Moore's cameo had any merit. Extraordinary legal warfare erupted from this production. Blake Edwards sued MGM for $180 million, claiming they sabotaged the film, and MGM countersued for $340 million, alleging fraudulent overspending. The disputes finally settled out of court in 1988. Edwards had considered Rowan Atkinson and Dudley Moore before casting Ted Wass. The attempt to continue without Sellers effectively ended the franchise until Son of the Pink Panther arrived a decade later. Ted Wass's sequel option was never exercised, and legal battles overshadowed any possibility of franchise continuation. The mistake that defined Burt Reynolds' decline has to be Stroker Ace, where Reynolds chose a car chase picture over what would become an Oscar-winning role. $14 to $15 million covered the budget, and earnings came in at approximately $13 million, creating a $1 to $2 million loss that marked Reynolds' first outright commercial failure of the decade. Universal Pictures distributed this Hal Needham-directed NASCAR comedy on July 1, 1983. Reynolds starred alongside his real-life partner Lonnie Anderson, plus Ned Beatty, Jim Nabors, Parker Stevenson, and Bubba Smith. Gene Siskel gave it 0 out of 4 stars, declaring that Reynolds' reputation as a serious actor is virtually destroyed with this miserable picture. Vincent Canby of the New York Times called it the must-miss movie of the summer, and Jim Nabors won the Razzie for Worst Supporting Actor. The behind-the-scenes story carries real weight. Reynolds turned down the role of Garrett Breedlove in terms of endearment to honor a verbal commitment to Hal Needham, and Jack Nicholson took that role instead, winning the Academy Award. Reynolds later called this the biggest regret of his career. That's where he lost the fans, Reynolds later said. Serious critical acclaim wouldn't return until Boogie Nights arrived 14 years later. Michael Mann's butchered vision became a case study in studio interference when The Keep transformed from an ambitious horror film into an incoherent mess. A modest $6 million budget yielded just $4.22 million in earnings, creating an estimated loss of $1.5 to $2.5 million. Paramount Pictures gave it only second-level advertising, essentially abandoning the film. Scott Glenn, Jürgen Schnau, Ian McKellen in one of his first film roles, Gabriel Byrne, and Alberta Watson starred in this supernatural thriller based on F. Paul Wilson's 1981 novel. Gene Siskel called it one of the most inaudible movies ever made. The Detroit Free Press described it as an unfortunate hybrid mutation of disco horror, rock video, high fashion, and imitation art. Author F. Paul Wilson called the film visually intriguing but otherwise utterly incomprehensible. Production troubles devastated everything about this project. Special effects supervisor Wally Weavers passed before completing key effects. Mann's 210-minute cut was ordered down to 120 minutes by Paramount, then further reduced to 96 minutes after poor test screenings. Filming extended from 13 weeks to 22 weeks. Mann has distanced himself from the film ever since, and the director's cut does not exist. A strong cult following has developed regardless, with Vinegar Syndrome releasing a 4K Ultra HD edition recently. Tragedy overshadowed Yellowbeard when Marty Feldman passed during filming from a heart attack on December 2, 1982, in Mexico City, caused by food poisoning combined with heavy smoking and high-altitude stress. A stunt double completed his remaining scenes. $6.5 million covered the budget, though some sources cite up to $10 million, and earnings reached just $4.3 million, leaving a loss of approximately $2.2 million or more. Orion Pictures distributed this Mel Damsky-directed pirate comedy on June 24, 1983. Graham Chapman wrote and starred as the titular pirate, joined by an extraordinary ensemble that included Peter Boyle, Marty Feldman, Eric Idle, John Cleese, Madeline Kahn, Cheech Marin, Tommy Chong, James Mason, Peter Cook, and Spike Milligan. Roger Ebert gave it 1.5 out of 4 stars, writing that Yellowbeard seems almost to have exhausted itself with its casting, and the movie itself is a chaotic mess, soon forgotten. Keith Moon of The Who originally funded the project and intended to play the lead, but Moon passed in 1978. John Cleese later called it one of the worst scripts he'd read. Chapman's intended Handmade Films deal fell apart, forcing the project into less sympathetic Hollywood hands, where his original vision was significantly altered. Dan Aykroyd's first major starring vehicle after John Belushi's passing turned into Dr. Detroit, and it proved a significant disappointment despite technically turning a profit. $8 million covered the budget, with earnings reaching $10.4 million, but the film was considered a major disappointment that immediately canceled the planned sequel. Universal Pictures released this Michael Pressman-directed comedy on May 6, 1983. Aykroyd starred as a meek college professor who transforms into flamboyant pimp Dr. Detroit to save a group of women from a crime boss, with the cast including Howard Hesseman, Donna Dixon, T.K. Carter, and Fran Drescher. TV Guide's assessment cut deep, declaring there isn't one laugh in this so-called comedy, and the resulting situations are so moronic that the movie is unwatchable. The timing proved career-threatening. Paramount executives worried about Trading Places' prospects after Dr. Detroit's poor reception, and Aykroyd reportedly took a significant pay cut to secure that role. Had Trading Places failed when it released 1 month later to a $90.4 million gross, Dr. Detroit would have derailed Aykroyd's post-Belushi career entirely. The quick success of Trading Places allowed audiences to forget this misfire. Nobody wanted The Sting 2, and a decade-late follow-up proved that some films shouldn't be continued under any circumstances. Paul Newman and Robert Redford both refused to return, so Universal Pictures cast Jackie Gleason as Fargo Gondorf and Mac Davis as Jake Hooker alongside Oliver Reed, Terry Garr, and Carl Malden. Director Jeremy Paul Kagan released this sequel on February 18, 1983, and these were different characters despite similar names, which confused audiences. Earnings reached just $6.35 million, representing a substantial loss given production and marketing costs. A 10% Rotten Tomatoes score tells you everything about critical reception. Puzzlingly, the film did receive an Oscar nomination for Best Musical Score by Lalo Schifrin, a recognition completely disconnected from everything else on screen. Director George Roy Hill declined to return from the original. The trick-heavy plot felt stale by 1983 standards, with audiences having moved on from the con man genre. Plans for a third Sting film were immediately canceled after this installment failed, confirming that franchise magic cannot be recaptured without the original talent. Budget overruns in pursuit of 3D technology doomed Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, before it ever reached audiences. Originally planned at just $2 to $4 million, costs exploded to $12 to $14 million due to stereoscopic 3D photography requirements. Columbia Pictures released this Lamont Johnson-directed film on May 20th, 1983, 1 week before Return of the Jedi crushed everything. Peter Strauss starred as Wolf alongside a 15-year-old Molly Ringwald, Michael Ironside, Ernie Hudson, and Andrea Marcovici. Ivan Reitman executive produced, and the film had 6 credited screenwriters, always a clear sign of troubled development. Janet Maslin wrote that the film attempts so much that it will probably remind you of at least a dozen other stories all mixed together. Peter Strauss himself later admitted it isn't the picture he thought he was making. Original director Jean Lafleur was replaced by Lamont Johnson after Ivan Reitman scrapped Lafleur's footage as test footage. Earnings reached $16.48 million domestically, which technically exceeded budget, but fell far below the ratio needed for profitability. Career impacts varied wildly. Molly Ringwald's career exploded with John Hughes films the following year. Ernie Hudson went on to Ghostbusters in 1984. Ivan Reitman made Ghostbusters immediately after, achieving massive success. Disney's hidden embarrassment Trenchcoat stayed so hidden that the studio refused to put its name on marketing materials. $8 million covered the budget for this Michael Tuchner-directed comedy mystery, but earnings reached just $4.3 million, creating an estimated $4 million loss. Walt Disney Productions released it on March 11, 1983, deliberately keeping Disney's name off everything due to adult themes. Margot Kidder and Robert Hayes starred, with David Suchet rounding out the cast. Screenwriters Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman would later redeem themselves spectacularly with Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Siskel and Ebert featured Trenchcoat on their Stinkers of '83 list, and Ebert declared it one of the most aggressively boring movies he'd seen in a long time. The Rotten Tomatoes score sits at just 33%. The film's historical significance extends beyond its failure. Along with Dragon Slayer and Never Cry Wolf, Trenchcoat's embarrassment prompted Disney to create Touchstone Pictures for adult-oriented content, a lasting corporate restructuring triggered by box office disaster. Common threads connected all 13 disasters of 1983: overconfident productions, troubled development, studio interference, and fatal timing against unstoppable competition like Return of the Jedi. Burt Reynolds' decline crystallized when he chose Stroker Ace over Terms of Endearment. John Travolta's wilderness years were cemented by Two of a Kind, while the Pink Panther franchise effectively ended through legal warfare. Fantasy ambitions were curtailed for years after Krull, The Keep, and Spacehunter made studios wary of expensive genre productions. Several failures found unlikely second lives over the decades, and The Keep developed devoted cult followings. Some careers survived and thrived despite the wreckage, with Liam Neeson, Robbie Coltrane, and Molly Ringwald all emerging to become major stars. And The Lonely Lady became the benchmark against which all bad films are measured. The lessons of 1983 still echo through Hollywood today. Star power alone cannot guarantee success. Franchise continuation without original talent courts disaster, and releasing fantasy films weeks before Star Wars remains inadvisable. These weren't just failures. They were cautionary tales that shaped how Hollywood approaches risk for decades to come.